So we would like to thank at this point the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, the sponsor of this activity, for their support. This conference is also organized by the Philippine Institute for Development Studies in cooperation with the DPRM Steering Committee. So these are the members of the Steering Committee, composed of the Civil Service Commission, Department of Budget and Management, Department of Interior and Local Government, Department of Economy, Planning and Development, House of Representatives Congressional Policy and Budget Research Department, Philippine Information Agency, Presidential Management Staff, Senate Economic Planning Office, and the Department of Science and Technology. So this year's APPC carries the theme, Reimagining Governance in the Age of AI, highlighting the urgent need for policies to guide AI use in government. Today's plenaries will explore AI in the context of global governance, energy, anti-corruption, and aging societies. To guide us through our first plenary session on global and regional perspectives on AI and governance, we are pleased to introduce our moderator. He is a technology and public policy professional with over a decade of experience in evidence-based research, digital economy, and cybersecurity. He currently serves as program lead at Tech for Good Institute in Singapore, where he designs and leads initiatives across Southeast Asia to leverage technology for sustainable, equitable, and inclusive growth. Please welcome Mr. Keith Detros.
Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. Thank you, Ms. Mel. Thank you for the kind introduction. One key aspect, although I would like to highlight in my background, although Ms. Mel has graciously given a kind introduction, was that my first job in the field of policy research and evidence-based policy research, which was actually at PIDS 15 years ago. I was a research assistant with Dr. Toots Albert and Dr. Adoracion Navarro. 15 years ago, and safe to say, there was no AI back then. It's wonderful to be back among friends and mentors, although I have to say, there's a little bit of pressure knowing that my former bosses and my former mentors are on stage, and if I can hear them now, they would tell me to stop sharing stories and just get back to work. So the theme of our plenary this morning is on artificial intelligence and governance. Now, when we hear the term AI, artificial intelligence, it's worth remembering that this is not entirely new. The phrase in itself was coined in 1956, apparently, in a conference in Dartmouth. And even in popular culture, if you look back at it, we have seen some sorts of applications of AI throughout our lives. Let's just take movies, for example. In the 1980s, we've seen what AI can do via Arnold Schwarzenegger and the Terminator movies. In the 1990s, The Matrix was also a movie about AI and what AI can do. And even for the millennials out there, WALL-E was a movie about AI. But it also begs the question, why? If it has been there since 1956, and we've seen it in popular culture, it begs the question why only in recent years, maybe in the past 5 to 10 years, that we have seen a rise in the discussion of governance of AI, and it has taken center stage on global debates. And I'd like to offer 3 hypotheses why. I think it's a matter of a pace of innovation, a pace of adoption, and a pace of disruption. First, innovation. The pace of technological innovation has been accelerating, and if our lives have changed before, there's no reason why technology will not change the future of our lives. And I think we are at that point, at an inflection point, where innovation in terms of AI is actually affecting each of our lives. We use it daily now. The pace of adoption has also changed a bit. The speed at which new technologies reach the public sphere is unprecedented. We are now a mobile-first, and in some, a mobile-only society. And ChatGPT, for example, famously reached 1 million users in just 5 days. To put that into context, Instagram took 3.5 years to reach that milestone, and Twitter, now X, took 2 years, and ChatGPT, 5 days. So the pace of adoption is really, really accelerating. But at the same time, aside from innovation, adoption, comes disruption. With innovation and or with disruption, it's a critical area for security and safety. If I raise my hand here, how many of us have seen a deep fake on any of our social media platforms? Quite sizable amount of people, right? And it's not just about the fakes and AI risks and safety, but also skills. The concern about AI replacing jobs, and maybe the IMF also last year noted that AI will affect almost 40% of the jobs around the world. And it is in this context of innovation, adoption, and disruption that we have this discussion on how do we govern AI, especially in the innovation age. And this is precisely the value of our plenary today, to look at the global as well as the regional perspective and experiences to reflect on what lessons can the Philippines take from it. In other words, we zoom out first. We zoom out what is happening around the world before we zoom in into the Philippine setting. And with this, it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today. He is a professor of international relations and a vice dean of the graduate school at the Tokyo International University. He also serves as deputy head of the program of AI governance at the Global Governance Institute in Brussels. His research explores the intersection of global governance, technology, and global justice, which are all critical areas that resonate deeply with today's theme. He's also the co-host of the Age of AI podcast, which examines how AI is transforming international politics and society, a Fulbright Fellow at the University of Zagreb, and a RCUK postdoctoral fellow at the University of Ulster. And he holds a PhD in politics from University of Glasgow, a Master's of Science degree from the University of Edinburgh, and a bachelor's degree from the University of Mississippi. And with his deep expertise and international perspective, he will help us situate the Philippines' AI governance journey within the broader global and regional context. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Professor Christopher Lamont.
I'd like to start by thanking the organizers from PIDS for organizing this wonderful and important policy conference on the question of AI governance. And also the two preceding keynote speakers for introducing many of the dilemmas that I will be discussing in the context of my own presentation. Now, if you look at my presentation, I intentionally titled it kind of AI governance, one world or many. And the message that I want to convey, or one of the messages that I want to convey to you is that there's a tendency when discussing AI governance in international forums that we are looking for kind of a common set of rules, guidelines, or governance strategies that would be global in nature. And although I'm the deputy head of the AI program at the Global Governance Institute, the program itself is AI governance, and I almost wish we could make that plural, an AI governances. The second overarching takeaway would be the target of AI governance. And as was so nicely set out by our moderator for this panel, AI is not new, right? And we were offered hypotheses as to why from about the 2010s, we really began talking about AI. Well, let me give you a little bit of background from my own research experience and how I got into AI in about the mid-2010s. So, of course, my previous research had largely focused on transitional justice. But in particular, with the kind of the post-ISIL accountability mission in Iraq and other UN mandated investigative missions, it became clear that AI tools were increasingly relied upon by these missions to do their investigative work. Now, on the one hand, there was a lot of optimism surrounding this in the early years because these tools offered a solution for a problem that there wasn't another solution for, and that is big data, right? If we think back kind of a decade ago, right, and the analysis of it and the ability to extract information relative to investigators, or sorry, relevant to investigators in these mandated missions that are often kind of not funded to the level that they would like to be funded. And the ability to aid in kind of accountability efforts was made possible through these tools. Right, you're looking at kind of billions of frames of, for example, digital video. You're looking at kind of massive digital kind of archives that come across kind of hundreds of thousands of potentially devices. But at the same time, there was something that became apparent. And that gets us to kind of the roadmap of this presentation. Let me see if I can get this. Yes, I just need to press harder. Kind of this idea of unevenness, and that was also something that came out earlier. And so I'll start with a brief introduction to this kind of idea of the post-digital AI governance debate. And this is not post-digital meaning kind of after digital, but this is thinking about digital transformation in the context of a world that's already experienced a wave of digital transformation. And also approaches to AI governance, and I don't like using kind of the terminology models here, right? Because these approaches largely reflect the kind of priorities and digital infrastructures that they emerge from. And of course, they're changing, as we'll see, with the US approach. And then also look at that, kind of map out the kind of the terrain of AI governance processes that are kind of multi-stakeholder or international, so looking at UN processes, G7 OECD, and then kind of themes in AI and digital governance. So, I've taken a step back here. There, yes, so the post-digital. Not an after, but an emphasis on uneven digitalizations, interdependencies, hierarchies, and path dependencies. What does this mean and kind of from a policy perspective? That means that kind of where you are in the global AI ecosystem will change your own kind of perspectives on strategies. The other thing to think about is turbulence. There's a tendency to think about AI adoption in terms of success or failure, but AI adoption is going to bring about turbulence, which is often disruptive, uncomfortable, right, unpleasant, and creates a problem for those who have not anticipated or planned it. But it can also be a powerful source of innovation and change. Sorry about this. There we go. Oh. Yes. So approaches to AI governance. Broad kind of mapping. Of course, you have the EU approach, which looks at a precautionary, risk-based approach, emphasis on human rights, hard law instruments. US approach, a shift, actually, a dramatic shift from the Biden administration, which had its own executive order on AI safety, and also kind of spearheaded a lot of discussions internationally on kind of AI governance, both in the civilian realm, but also if you think about the kind of military realm as well. And if that has been undone by the current administration, which has taken a very different tack that's now focused on the diffusion of the full US tech stack through various tools such as export controls. And then China's approach, which is kind of emphasis on developing national models for governance, kind of emphasis on sovereignty, but also diffusion through open and smaller and cheaper models for practical use in markets, right? The Chinese AI ecosystem is now kind of vast and something that you're also very familiar with. The EU approach has been percolating for some time, right? You can go back to 2018, the GDPR, which kind of is the backdrop to a lot of discussions that informed the EU AI Act. Much of the discussions, though, leading up to the EU AI Act preceded kind of a lot of the large transformations and innovations when it came to LLMs. You also have the EU Digital Services Act from 2002 that seeks to regulate kind of large platforms or very large platforms. And also, importantly, the Council of Europe Framework Convention on Artificial Intelligence and Human Rights, Democracy, and the Rule of Law from 2024. And here kind of are some key features, right? Accountability for online platforms, kind of Digital Services Act, kind of special obligations for very large online platforms, risk-based regulatory framework for AI. We can get back to this in the discussion. And rights-based and kind of non-discrimination AI Act, but you also see that in the Council of Europe Convention, and also enforcement through an EU AI office, which is beginning work in Brussels. The US approach, I mentioned a change, so I'm not going to go back previous to 2025, because a lot of those efforts have kind of come to an end. But you have an emphasis now on securing American leadership in artificial intelligence by the current administration. And it's largely kind of reversed the safety-based approach set out in Biden administration's Executive Order 14110 from 2003, kind of not just symbolically, but kind of quite importantly, significantly, the AI Safety Institutes was renamed the Center for AI Standards and Innovation, and Shift in Mission. And then you had the 3-point AI Action Plan, which kind of emphasizes both innovation, infrastructure, and also kind of diffusing US, not just AI, but kind of the full tech stack to international markets. US approach kind of sees this in terms of more competitive terms, kind of winning the race for AI as language used in the action plan. And also there is a perceived trade-off between kind of regulatory burdens and compliance costs and innovation, and an emphasis on kind of big tech, right? Kind of setting kind of lofty goals in terms of artificial general intelligence and export controls and promoting US technical standards globally. China's approach, something that you hear a lot about now more recently, right? You've had kind of an early mover in China as kind of a regulator of generative AI with standards for both kind of at the design level, but also at the user level for stamping kind of AI-generated content. And also you had kind of emphasis on AI governance initiatives that are more focused on the UN. And we'll get to that in a second. Shanghai Declaration on Global AI Governance and Global AI Governance Action Plan. And here the difference is there's a large emphasis on the Global South and diffusion for practical markets. So here are some of the features of China's plan that I'd covered in the kind of previous slide. And then getting very briefly to the global processes that I want to map out for you. Of course, some of these were mentioned in some of in previous talks. Of course, UNESCO's recommendations on ethics of AI, kind of non-binding principles, kind of alignment in terms of values. UN Secretary General's high-level advisory body kind of recommended, along with the digital compact that comes out of the General Assembly process below, a UN AI office to coordinate international governance efforts. And you've had a lot of developments within the UN General Assembly in terms of China's resolution and the US's resolution. So you had China's resolution for AI development capacity building and the US's resolution on AI governance with an emphasis on safety and human rights, and of course the digital compact coming out of the UN Summit for the Future. Noticed that the clock is ticking so quickly, kind of multi-stakeholder forums as well. You have the G7 process and the OECD process. Japan, actually, so the country that I kind of currently live and work in, has taken a leading role in advancing this conversation on AI safety that reflects kind of a Japanese domestic AI governance preference towards non-binding guidelines that do have an emphasis on human-centeredness, human rights, and safety. And here you have alignment within G7 states, the EU AI office, and the OECD AI. Of course, this is kind of the thing about the AI safety summits. You had a shift in 2025 with the kind of Paris AI Safety Summit being the Paris AI Action Summit. Again, kind of a shift in this perception between kind of regulatory burden and compliance and its impact on innovation. So I want to kind of just wrap up kind of this roadmap for you with some of the kind of other geographical features of this terrain that are not necessarily governance efforts. One, increasing importance and salience of this, not just in terms of kind of development, but also in terms of international security and international cooperation, international security and international cooperation, and also global strategies and global AI ecosystems that are being crafted to bring together priorities with vulnerabilities. And things to think about are AI and digital infrastructure. Mentioned includes data centers, physical supply chains, 5G networks, undersea cables, AI and cybersecurity, enhancing cybersecurity awareness and capabilities as kind of more powerful AI tools create new vulnerabilities in relation to cybersecurity. And then something else, AI and information, right? So kind of this question of kind of misinformation and disinformation that is more widely accessible, and kind of previously mentioned one previously, who has seen deepfakes, right? Which in turn requires a greater degree of AI literacy, right, to understand kind of what these images are, since they are not going away. So taking stock of AI governance, as I mentioned at the outset, we need to highlight the unevenness, contradictions, vulnerability, and turbulence, right? US-China strategic competition and competing models for AI governance and tech diffusion, right? You might think about kind of which tech stack will fuel AI accelerated growth. Also, where these multi-stakeholder governance initiatives are going in light of the recent changes in the US's own posture and approach to AI governance. right? You still have a strong kind of human rights and values-based approach to understanding kind of AI risk and governance within the EU and Council of Europe framework. Also, increasingly, kind of the role of the UN, the UN Summit of the Future, and in emphasis on inclusiveness, and then other multi-stakeholder forums, not just the G7, but you might think about the G20. And remember, these problems emerge at every stage of the AI life cycle. And there are new stages that are emerging that I think that, for example, LLMs caught a lot of people off guard. And right now we think about jailbreaking LLMs as a risk. And I think I'll leave you with one additional one, right? If you think about kind of humanoid robotics as a field where there are a lot of developments in the present, kind of the jailbreaking of humanoid robotics as they move out of controlled environments potentially into kind of public spaces. So we're not going to have one world of AI governance, but many worlds. So thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chris. Can I ask you to just stay on stage as we will continue with our panel discussion for today? And so while we welcome all our other discussants, and they are setting up for now, let me take this time, actually. Thank you again, Chris. Very great presentation. Let me introduce our first of the discussants. He is a senior digital specialist at the World Bank, where he leads initiatives on digital connectivity, data, AI, and digital government in the Philippines. With prior experience at McKinsey, MIT, and as co-founder of a mobile internet startup in Japan, he brings deep expertise in technology and innovation with a lens for development. Please welcome Mr. Naoto Kanehira. Thank you, Naoto. Great. Our second discussant is Ms. Mary Grace Mirandilla-Santos, an independent tech policy researcher and an lead advocate of the Better Internet Philippines. Better Internet PH successfully pushed for the open access in data transmission law. She also works with global institutions like the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank, and has been active in AI and cybersecurity policy through Learn Asia and the Global Index on Responsible AI. Please welcome Ms. Mary Grace Mirandilla-Santos. Finally, our third discussant is the Institute Director at the Tech for Good Institute. She has led cross-sector collaborations and digital adoption programs across Southeast Asia. She previously headed digital tourism initiatives at Malaysia's Digital Economy Corporation. Please welcome Ms. Arifah Sharifuddin. Great. Good morning again, everybody. And thank you again, Chris, for setting the stage and giving us an overview of global governance mechanisms. And there are several approaches, and you ended with many worlds of governance for AI. And there are various approaches to ensuring that there's this balance of promoting the digital economy and digital innovation, but at the same time, what I'm hearing is that there's also the protection of the digital society that is an important component, and that's why there are various ways to govern emerging technologies. With the discussants on stage, can I ask each one of the discussants to share some of your reactions, comments, insights on the presentation? And maybe you are also welcome. We would welcome you to also share a little bit about your work in the field of AI. Maybe we start with Naoto first.
Thank you very much, Keith. Distinguished guests, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for invitation. and I'm privileged to be here to join this very important conversation. The quick reaction to the presentation, yes, indeed, the global AI governance is facing increasing divergence, the difficulties for international cooperation. I think the dilemma here is the proper balance between enabling and safeguarding, and the importance of international collaboration for interoperable, harmonized, open systems to foster trust and pursue economy of scale and cross synergies across public, private, government, civil society, industry, data ecosystems to feed into AI ecosystems, which is a challenge. If I may, if I quickly go.
We can go with your presentation first if you like.
Okay, I have my clicker.
Clicker will be handed out to you.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah,
they're preparing your presentation. Maybe we can touch a bit on some of these divergences you just mentioned. Some few aspects that you're seeing in your line of work about different approaches that developing countries or the World Bank is seeing within the governance of AI. Other divergences, some differences in emerging approaches that you are seeing in terms of governing AI. What are those key aspects that you are seeing?
Well, emphasis on sovereignty, like we see in China, versus emphasis on competitiveness. And let's say the belief in the power of self-regulation by the private actors versus the emphasis on the need for regulation and especially the hard law and the legal instruments. So, and then the openness for the regional and global harmonization with the values-based principles and ethics and responsibility. I think these are the key parameters around which we are thinking.
Maybe we can dive in a little bit about that idea of sovereignty later on. And I think your slide is actually up here already. So maybe you can take us through some of your thinking about some reactions of Chris's presentation.
Sure. So AI in developing countries. AI is now the World Bank's one of the top priorities as expressed in the new digital strategy of the World Bank we launched 2 months ago, and which has 5 pillars. And these are all very straightforward. So it starts with connectivity, to address existing digital divides and ensure digital and AI opportunities for all. The second is computing. So data centers, cloud computing, these are the foundational infrastructure for AI workloads. The third is data. It's accessible, relevant, inclusive data, quality data, which provides context for AI systems to help address local problems. The fourth is competency. This is human capital, digital workforce. The fifth is the topic of this presentation. It's the AI governance rules, policies, regulations, or norms, which hopefully global AI governance can converge, but it's at this point governance is. So the 4 C's plus R. I don't know why nobody was able to come up with the 5th C for the name of this. So we call it 4 C's and 1 R. In the Philippines, we have major gaps in all of the 5. But we also have been seeing good progress on some of these. The Connected Pinoy Act addressing connectivity issue is one major step. Which of these areas require additional efforts against the gaps? My response would be the data, the context. So the policy debates around AI and data infrastructure and data governance, we see some imbalances, I would say. So like in today's conference, everyone would want to talk about AI. Right? And then almost nobody wants to talk about data seriously. But now we are seeing some people increasingly wanting to talk about data center, data infrastructure, and putting on table proposals like data localization without considering its implications and the content of data and use of data. So first I want to address this computing or data infrastructure. We indeed have very, let's say, low level of maturity of data infrastructure in the Philippines. But it's not just about supply constraint, it's also the demand weakness. So the graph here, the first one compares countries, middle-income countries across income spectrum with two indicators. So one is domestic data center capacity, shown in the dots. The second indicator is import of foreign cloud service, shown by cross marks, both normalized by population. So what we have in the Philippines, in this red dot and circle, cross mark is interesting. The data center capacity domestically is roughly the same as the countries with similar income level. But the cloud import is far lower than, even lower than Cambodia, lower than Vietnam, Indonesia. And these are the countries that apply more strict data localization requirements. So localizing data actually doesn't help boost their domestic data center capacity, and they're using cloud service from foreign providers anyways. The second graph shows domestic data center capacity growth over the last few years in the context of the market share of telecommunications operators. So what we see is the reverse, let's say, negative correlation, right? And which is quite natural. If there is barrier for entry and investment, not just by domestic telcos, but foreign cloud service providers, co-location providers, carrier-neutral operators, hyperscalers, then you'll see very slow growth. And we are on the right path to unlock data center connectivity investment through Connected on Pinoy Act. Further expand. It's not just pushing supply, but stimulate demand and lowering barrier to entry and investment and lowering the cost of cloud adoption by firms. So that some of the measures put on table like localization, I would say it's not necessarily the right answer. And then taking more closely at the data, we do have data problems. Through the World Bank's work across many, many sectors with the government, we see data is often fragmented, inaccurate, incomplete, not shareable, or even not machine readable. And there are reasons for that. It's a complicated table. I wouldn't go into deep details of this, but there are 4 key levers: strategy, laws, technical platforms, the standards, and institutions. Philippines is missing almost all of them. Let's just quickly go one by one. The strategies. So we have high-income country examples, middle-income countries examples, having varying data strategies. The Philippines doesn't have it. The laws, what it takes is the good balance between protecting and enabling data sharing. So different countries have different ways of doing it. It also depends on the scope of data protection laws. Some countries do umbrella law. Some countries do governing data protection only in the industry, and government is subject to different set of laws. The Philippines have good Data Privacy Act, and lacking the balance with enabling or authorizing or incentivizing or encouraging data sharing to improve policies and services. The third component is technical platforms, standards, issuances, which many countries have through open APIs, the standards, data exchange platforms. Philippines, so I don't arbitrarily pick what each country have. There are some comparative methodology published through USA and ICTS. In that standard, the Philippines have something on paper, but not adopted. Then the institutions. So data stewardship, data custodianship, interagency coordination to apply consistent data collection and management and sharing practices. Typically, countries have data strategy to define interagency institutional responsibilities. The Philippines doesn't have it. What other countries have is equivalent to the Philippines DOF or DepDev or PSA, or the ICT, or some of them, or interagency mechanism aligning all of these agencies. The Philippines doesn't have it. The practical starting point in these environments, not just in the Philippines, but we are starting to experiment AI-ready data capacity building across countries. What we are learning is the most practical way is to start with the most impactful use cases. AI is a tool. The aim is to improve people's lives, solving problems that people face. For that, we need to identify what data is needed to do, what kind of AI applications and models to solve what problems. I wouldn't dive into the deep technicalities here, but we are starting with multiple government agencies in the Philippines, such as in agriculture, finance, social protection, disaster risk resilience. The problems cutting across these domains are most transformational, and there are existing data which is fragmented and not fully utilized for policies and services, then potential for AI. So let me conclude by saying AI is providing tremendous opportunities to improve services and policies, but the data challenge prevails. To address it, it will take openness, collaboration, trust. So let's work together. World Bank is here to help, so let's talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Naoto. Thank you so much. A few things that stood out there is, of course, the 4 C's of competency, computing, and all. And the second slide was about even the competition aspect of it, which I think just flows nicely into what I think Grace would also touch on, which is the connectivity and the competition of it. But Grace, maybe I turn to you for your quick reactions towards Chris's presentation about various governance mechanisms across AI in the Philippine context.
Thank you, Keith. So I'd like to thank Professor for that very insightful presentation. It actually touches on one important aspect of AI for the Philippines, which is where we are and what we see our position to be in the vast and still unknown AI landscape. So Professor talked about the US model, EU model, and China approach. This has been a recurring issue for the Philippines in many, many policy issues. We always look to other countries, especially the US and the EU and our big neighbors, to decide on what we want to do with our own AI. To quote the late Dr. Eileen Baviera, who was my first boss in the country, she was a China expert and a Southeast Asia security expert. She said that while we are so confused about what other countries intend to do, we must focus on the Philippines' interest first and foremost. Why do I emphasize this? We are actually at a very good position because we're a latecomer. There's always a benefit to being a latecomer because you see what other countries are doing, what they have successfully done, what their mistakes are. So as a latecomer, and this is not to defend the Philippines being a laggard, no, but this is something, look at the silver lining of being late in the game, is to look at how the Philippines can best position itself and actually create an environment not to be, let's say, not to put ourselves in a position so that we are in the favor of one country or one region, but put ourselves in a position where, as Naoto said, where AI can actually have an impact on the lives of Filipinos. The EU's approach is risk-based. It always looks at things, I mean, from the beginning, the GDPR has always been one of the most stringent frameworks that we're using for data privacy and protection. So it's risk-based and it classifies AI consistently by the level of risk that it poses on users. The US, on the other hand, is more of a, at least with the current administration, looks at it from a sandbox perspective. The US style is more of industry self-governance and voluntary. Well, it promotes voluntary standards for companies, especially for MSMEs, right, Professor? So, are we to choose between heavy-handed, pressure on our government or a more lax approach? I say we choose the different aspects of these two approaches that would best apply to the Philippines. Also, we have to, I guess, not take a position as to whether we are pro or against a particular country, because innovation comes from everywhere. In this room, I would tell you that all of us here are using, let's say, technology that has become cheaper and more accessible because of innovation that has come from countries other than the West. So we should not discount what different countries have to offer. So if we look at AI from a risk-based approach, it would be too costly, especially for Filipinos. Startup companies, MSMEs, local governments who are looking at AI as a viable solution to many of the governance issues may not be accessible. If we look at it, if you look at AI solely or primarily from a risk-based approach, I personally think as a tech policy person that we should not demonize technology. Demonizing AI would be like how the print technology, became more accessible to the masses, or how the computer, when it became cheaper and it was available to use in our own homes, diba? There were so many doomsday scenarios that we were looking at when new technologies, emerging technologies come into the picture. Like, perhaps we will lose our jobs because of the printing machines, or perhaps we no longer need the manual laborers when the computers become accessible. And as we see now, people adapt with the right balance of policy and promoting innovation. We can actually thrive using these technologies. If we look at the US model, despite the fact that the NIST already has an AI risk management framework, we cannot also afford to be too loose or lax about AI development and use. But from our perspective, the Philippines is not an AI developing. We don't develop AI. We are largely AI users. We have to take into consideration that when we put policy in place, will it actually make an impact in terms of how AI is being developed? Who's developing AI? Can our laws actually influence how AI is being used? So I guess that is where Naoto's presentation also comes in. Perhaps we should look at what policy, Philippine policy can best influence, which is data. So our data is very valuable and we don't even know it. I don't think the government even looks at data as an asset that can be used, not to monetize it, but really the value of data in terms of how it, when used properly, can be used for better governance, for producing evidence-based policy making and regulation. Data in itself does not have value if it is not properly classified, not processed, managed, and not shared. That has been a recurring discussion in many industries and levels of governance. So we have to make sure that the policy we're putting in place would actually be geared towards how we can extract the value of AI, and perhaps we should start with addressing key barriers. So data governance is one, connectivity, I'm happy to report, hopefully will be addressed because of the Konektadong Pinoy Act that was recently signed. AI will play a major role also in the implementation of the recently enacted E-Governance Act, where government can look at AI as an opportunity to better improve processes and outcomes. I guess finally, the one barrier that all of us perhaps not only knows but feels is the skilling of Filipinos. There is much talk about upskilling, reskilling. There's this buzzword, but who are we upskilling? Do we even know what the industry needs? Do we even know the skills set that our Filipino citizens have? I note that the president recently gave a directive to the Department of Science and Technology, and also directed other agencies such as the DepDev and the DICT to work together. But we need to identify first what kind of skills, what is even an AI skill, and how we see the future of the Filipino workforce ahead of us, augmented by AI, so that we will not all be fearful of job displacement, but rather we will be hopeful of an AI-enabled Filipino workforce. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grace. And I think that folds nicely, really, on. I know some of us are already thinking about some questions out there, but a few things that you've mentioned. No? The second mover advantage is also an advantage in itself, not only the first mover ones. The Goldilocks approach that you're saying, not too soft, not too hard. The real answer lies if it's just right, but the challenge really is finding that balance, and that balance is different from each and every country. And what does that look like for the Philippines? But before we go back to the Philippines, though, I mean, Arifah, Tech for Good Institute is also a regional think tank. Maybe you also want, as they prepare your slides, maybe it's also good to zoom out a little bit. As Grace mentioned, there's an EU approach, there's a US approach, but there's possibly as well an ASEAN approach to all of this, which is what other countries are doing. And while they're preparing your slides, maybe you can also just talk about a bit, some reactions to Chris's presentation.
Thank you so much, Keith. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, firstly, thank you to PIDS for inviting TFJI to be part of this very important dialogue. For the second time, actually, we were first together with PIDS 2 years ago at the 9th APPC. Just a quick note about what Tech for Good Institute is. We are a regional think tank. We're based in Singapore, civil society organization, nonprofit, and we are intentionally bringing regional perspectives to the tech ecosystem, including governments, with regards to tech policy and digital economy. In responding to Chris's excellent presentation earlier, in essence, basically, the Southeast Asian countries are basically experiencing very, very similar challenges in navigating the advancements in technology and specifically in AI. So as we all may be aware, there are some numbers of projection about how AI would potentially contribute to about $1 trillion to the GDP of the region by 2030, right? But how does this actually translate to real at implementation level, ground level? What does it mean to the people? What does it mean to the government even, right? Of course, at the ASEAN level, there are already existing guidelines which have been published. Like, for example, the ASEAN Guide on AI Governance and Ethics, which have been published in 2024, and then further supplemented by an expanded ASEAN Guide on AI Governance and Ethics with a focus on generative AI. We are hoping that for potentially, maybe by next year, something on agentic AI will also be published. And then under Malaysia's chairmanship this year, there is an attempt to form the ASEAN AI Safety Network. So it is something that the Malaysian government is strongly trying to put together in the hopes to actually provide the necessary framework for the region under the ASEAN chairmanship. And then, of course, the potential is there with all of these regional level frameworks and roadmaps. But of course, the challenges are real at the respective country level, right? Within the largest 6 markets in Southeast Asia, namely, Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, only 15% of organizations have deployed AI in their business operations. And then only 30% are still at planning stage, let alone wanting to actually implement AI. And another thing that we want to highlight, actually, it really is the major constraint to all this adoption is actually talent, like what Ms. Grace and Naoto has mentioned earlier about, especially in the mid and senior levels, about AI talent. And what is this AI talent actually, right? It's not necessarily meaning that you have to be a developer of AI, a creator of AI, but it's actually how do you use AI as a leader, as a middle management, as a senior leader? Do you understand that? Do you understand AI when you want to manage your team, right? And this was also a discussion that that was done just last month in Kuala Lumpur. There was an ASEAN Green Forum Jobs. So there was a discussion that was that I was moderating, and a representative from World Economic Forum also mentioned that actually the soft skills as we know it is no longer soft skills. Soft skills are now the core skills to actually drive AI adoption. So we cannot actually refer to soft skills as soft skills anymore. Yeah. Okay, and then finally, actually I want to share a little bit on how the governments in Southeast Asia are responding to AI development. Can we have my slide up? Okay, can we click to the next slide, please? Yes, okay. So basically, these are what the governments in Southeast Asia are coordinating themselves, right? Like how they want to govern AI. Singapore has issued a model AI governance framework in 2024 for generative AI specifically, building on a framework that they have developed back in 2019. Thailand, on the other hand, has adopted a phased approach, beginning with the AI governance guidelines for executive, and then moving forward towards a more specific guidelines for organization, which is very similar to what the approach that Malaysia has taken, aside from the relevant frameworks. And I think Naoto actually shared earlier, policy was introduced all the way back in 2016, that's 10 years ago, right? And then now, at the moment, are supplementing the relevant frameworks with actual initiatives. Like one of the key things, the key initiative that was done by MyDeal, for example, is an executive digital leadership program, where they actually collaborate with MIT Sloan University as well as the Asia School of Business on how to elevate the skilling that is needed in both the public and the private sector. So private sector can also sign up for this program, but they have to pay for it. But for the public sector, it's actually sponsored by the government. And then also, finally, some governments are moving towards a more binding regulation. So for example, Indonesia is developing a draft AI regulation that includes mandatory risk classification and liability frameworks for high-risk system. So these are basically some examples on how the governments in Southeast Asia is responding to it. And then, taken together, you can see that Southeast Asian countries are experimenting still, which is great. And it is really good to see that the government has political will to do experimentation. a lot of governments in Southeast Asia tend to not favor piloting or doing POCs at the risk of pilot and POCs being a failure, right? But this is how you actually build better products. When you fail, you actually learn from it and then try and do better. I think I was just sharing this analogy with Chris last night during dinner about how there was a question that I posed to a China public service officer back in 2018. He was sharing some numbers on agriculture technology adoption and pilots which are taken by the Chinese government in all the respective districts. Thousands of pilots that they took upon. And then I asked, what's the success rate? And he was like casually mentioning 10 to 20% success rate. And then I asked again, what do you do with the failed 80, 90%? And he said, it's okay. We just left it, acknowledge it as a failure, and then we move on. And we work on the 10, 20% which are successful. So to me, that was, at that time, it was a very an eye-opening because there are governments in the world which actually appreciate the way how technology advances. Yeah. So, in summary, I just want to say that the Southeast Asia region, very similar to the EU, US, and China, and it is, the same uneven adoption, significant capacity gaps, building talent pipelines, and then, of course, showing creativity in governance response. Thank you.
Thank you, Arifah. And let me give a round of applause to all first hour panelists for their discussants and their insights, right? And a few themes come to mind. There's no one way to do this. US, China, EU model. The data connectivity and computing power remains an issue. The ASEAN approaches also differs. And what does that mean for the Philippines as well? I do have a lot of questions, but I would take this opportunity to remind our audience, both online and here within the room, to think about your questions. If you're online and on Zoom, please use the Zoom Q&A function and feature to send your questions in. Our lovely secretariat team will be throwing them to us as you type them in. And if you're on Facebook, just comment your questions and we will also gather them up for our panelists to answer. And if you're in the room, do think about some of the questions that you may want to ask our panelists today. Let me go back to Chris. Chris, hearing all of that, right? How AI governance is, maybe we operationalize it a bit. A lot of our audience members here are both from the private sector and most actually are from the public sector. And a lot of the conversations really resonate towards how AI can touch on public service delivery. As the speech earlier by Secretary Balisacan as well was on, like, how can this better evolve our public service delivery in terms, at least in the context of the Philippines. So a question for you is that, are there emerging issues that is less talked about, especially in the AI public service delivery, but maybe may have a critical or crucial implication, a blind spot that usually is an afterthought?
Absolutely. First, I'd like to thank the discussants for their insights into this topic. And I think one thing that's very important that came across all of the discussant remarks is that while this is a conference on AI governance, it could very well be a conference on data governance. And I think when thinking about kind of blind spots and in the public sector when it comes to AI governance or kind of implementation or operationalization of AI is the tendency to see AI as something that should be, right, adopted without thinking about the problem set. And as was mentioned in context of like leaders, business leaders, or kind of, or civil servants in terms of adoption, you'd want to think about kind of the underlying data. And I've had a couple conversations kind of recently about this question of AI governance and the challenges that are posed. And you're right, you don't want to demonize, right, this technology. It's incredibly empowering, it's augmenting of ability, and this focus on kind of the actual kind of makeup of the models themselves that has been at the center, right? The computing power, the flops, right? The kind of the characteristics has sent, and I think that I wouldn't say countries like the Philippines are kind of second movers or ranking this in terms of some sort of competitive race. because other countries are at a different place in kind of digital ecosystems, right? Just like it's not something that is comparable in such terms. That one of the things that that is observable is just the challenge, right, of maintaining that kind of focus, like centering AI in debates on regulation without talking about the data. And as I mentioned, kind of in some conversations with Gupta at the Berkeley AI Lab, who has published a paper on this, his belief is that in order to better understand kind of the kind of misuse, right, the things that we're concerned about in terms of these models, you don't look at the computing power and you don't look at them, define them into like foundation models or frontier models, but simply look at the data that they're being trained on, right? Like you see it in the defense sector. If you want to know about a decision support system, what its purpose is, you don't look at the model itself, but you look at the data that the model is being trained on. And if you take a data-centric approach to all this in terms of public sector, you might ask yourself, so before you're considering kind of AI adoption, what is kind of the data that you have? Is it intelligible, right? And how will that feed into the model? And I think that there are a lot of positives here when thinking about beyond the LLM bubble. But unfortunately, again, that for a lot of people, a lot of people have begun to tend to see like AI and LLMs synonymously. So when you say AI governance, immediately what pops into the mind is LLMs. But of course, you have tremendous developments when it comes to computer vision in chaotic environments. This has particular applications from the context of countries like Japan, but also the Philippines, which are exposed to kind of major disasters, right? To be able to see where know where victims are in an environment where the normal vision, right? And the models that something might have been trained on in terms of perfect kind of atmospheric conditions would be disrupted by fire, or ash and all these other developments, right? So there are tremendous developments that are happening outside the LLM world, but also a focus on the data as opposed to the model, and understanding the data before thinking about AI adoption.
Thank you. And I guess what I'm hearing is, if you think about AI, as you were mentioning, Chris, it's a tech stack. It's actually a life cycle if you think about it. And what we are seeing is the LLM, because that's the application and that's the consumer facing. That's on our phone. But if you think about it, as you mentioned, there's data. But even before data, I was talking to Attorney Mona earlier, there's energy that powers your data centers that we need for your data, that your model is going to be built upon, where the LLM comes in and then the application comes in. And what I'm hearing is that that's a blind spot that you are seeing, that should be crucial. That's why it's not only AI governance, but maybe energy governance, data center governance, data governance, water governance. Yeah,
right. There are a lot of examples about this, and I think that in discussions at the UN Summit for the Future, right, you've had a tremendous growth in data centers in regions like Latin America. And some of these regions are already semi-arid, and you're beginning to see the trade-offs in terms of, in some areas where water would go to farmland, it's now going to data centers, right? And so what does that mean? What is the implication of that for kind of water, for energy, and for all these other?
Which leads me to you, Grace, on these, like, from your background in telecoms, connectivity, and critical infrastructure as a whole, countries or the region are trying to ensure that AI systems in public services are reliable and resilient. But is there any critical areas that we should be looking at as well, building on this Chris's point about critical infrastructure and critical foundations?
Yeah. I would say that we should be looking at critical infrastructure, well, not just for AI, but really for basic use. Unfortunately, we are, technology is catching up, and to digitalize and to really harness the benefits of technology. Now we are looking at all these infrastructure and telling ourselves, how can we even go to, let's say, support AI if, for example, in terms of water, we do not have good irrigation for our farmlands, or even renewable energy. We are developing energy sources for AI now, but really, in terms of electrification, we still have, some areas in the Philippines that would need that, and we need reliable and cheaper energy. So it's not to, let's say, deflect what you're asking, but really how we prioritize the promotion of the use of these critical infrastructure is as important for basic use as it is for AI, because now we will have to decide how to prioritize. But one thing that I'd like to add as well is that in terms of these critical infrastructure, more and more they are using information and communications technology systems and networks, and that is where the protection of critical information infrastructure comes in, right? This is where I think one of the, a major gap in terms of policy. It is time for the Philippines to look at how we are protecting critical information infrastructure. And it's not only physical security. We're talking about cybersecurity. The Philippines doesn't have yet a cybersecurity law. In terms of policy, we do have executive policy, but only at the department level. So we need to, I would say, before we push for, let's say, adoption of more technology, or perhaps in parallel, we have to make sure that we have the right policies in place. It could be an executive order on the protection of CII, especially for government. But in a more comprehensive approach would be having a cybersecurity law that would not only cover the use of critical infrastructure, but different types of technology, and also taking into consideration emerging technologies such as AI.
Right. So that's a part of the critical infrastructure public service delivery. Just make think, that's the Philippine context. Or if I turn to you, the Malaysian hat, and given your experience in leading some digitalization initiatives within the Malaysian government, any of these points resonate to you in terms of those foundations, and maybe what did you do in Malaysia when you were starting to think about digitalization and all?
Thank you, Keith, for the question. First of all, I would want to say that digital transformation in public service delivery is really hard. That is something that's really hard. And in my past life, one of the first portfolio that I took on was actually digital government transformation. The government wanted to have more citizen-centric online services, and I was hired in because of my skills in customer experience in the private sector, specifically in the bank, right? So that was one of the first indication that the Malaysian government was open to, hiring private sector talent to actually come in and make that transformation work to happen. But then one of the key challenge is actually basically enhancing the understanding of what digitalization is. Back then, 10 years ago, it was still digitizing, meaning just converting paper to computerized or electronic form of data, right? And then, having cleared that hurdle, it was also an effort for the organization to actually understand what is digitalizing. How digitalizing, whereby you actually need to change your processes and your how you do work while being supported by technology. So that actually, aside from us sharing, best practices in other countries, it's also a continuous education that needed to be done as part of change management, making sure that the message is clear, narrative is clear, and the understanding is there to continuously guide the public sector officers in, making the changes that is required in their space. And the second challenge was actually talent. So that actually the one I mentioned about education, reminding them about differences between digitalizing, breaking down complex technical terms into a more understandable nuggets of information. It's actually a lot more helpful. And then, of course, we had to contend with legacy systems. That was one of our challenges last time. And then it was not just about outdated technology, it is also the way the guidelines or regulations and even act, how that process needed to be enhanced to keep up with the times. You cannot wait, you cannot take 5 years to make a revision to an act. I think it is a normal, this is a normal pace of change when it comes to revision for an act, for example. The fastest that I have experienced in the Malaysian government, 2 years to make act revision. So it's not easy. And then of course, strategy and coordination. I think this is also a key challenge amongst Southeast Asian government. It's just the way how the government is set up. It tends to be sector agnostic, right? The ministries are set up in a certain way, but however, there needs to be a platform for all these various ministries to actually work together. So an example that I can give towards for Malaysian government is actually we have the Digital Economy and 4th IR Council, which is chaired by the Prime Minister. So all the ministers responsible for respective areas, respective sectors, agriculture, economy and trade, digital minister even, they all sit in there and they discuss strategies and issues relating to 4th IR and digital economy. Even at Malaysia, the digital ministry used to be combined together with the communications ministry. However, at the end of 2023, in December, this ministry was split into two. So communications ministry is responsible to provide the communication infrastructure, the 5G rollout, for example, the 4G, ensuring all residential areas in Malaysia are connected to 4G. We have already achieved 100%. And then right now, rolling out 5G to enable all this wonderful AI technology that's coming in, which is under the responsibility of the digital ministry. So when you have a platform where the top leader of the country makes decision and minutes it out, that is your source of authority, which is very important in any government, right? Because if you are, let's say, I'm from digital ministry, I have no jurisdiction in the agriculture ministry. However, because I have this source of authority given by the Prime Minister at this platform of 4th IR and Digital Economy Council, I can actually implement this strategy together with the Agriculture Ministry in advancing AgTech, for example. So that's just an example of challenge and how we are addressing it.
Thank you so much. And maybe later, it's not only questions, but there are comments probably on the floor as well that can give us a sense of the Philippine situation. I know there's an innovation council in the Philippines. You mentioned there's this council, AI council, or a technology council that in Malaysia that actually coordinates. And maybe we can hear also from the floor that those kinds of innovation or ideas in terms of governance. Naoto, I want to bring you into this conversation because as Grace and Chris and Arifah just mentioned, right, there are key challenges within digital transformation, and sometimes a lot of the discussion comes with limited resources, challenging in talent, and all that. So I wanna. You work at the World Bank, for example, and often you're involved working with developing nations. We've heard from the Malaysian experience. I also just wanna understand how does countries with limited financial capabilities as well as technical resources, how can they start their journey towards this AI digital transformation for public service delivery? And what are those key experiences that you have seen?
So, look, AI, for most countries, AI is still a new topic, but constraints are so heavy and multi-level, right? Institutions, finance, capabilities, workforce. So, and frankly, we have to do everything together. But what we are seeing is actually earlier point on the blind spot. So AI or data and AI both are important for evidence policy making and public service delivery, but not only for that. Because of the multiplicity of data, multiplying value once data is combined and shared across sectors. So World Bank published in 2021 the World Development Report on Data for Better Lives. And what it said is there are three main channels for data to generate value for development. I think AI will just amplify these values. So one is through citizens and civil societies for greater transparency and accountability. The second is through the government for evidence-based policymaking and better service delivery, which is adapted, well-targeted, responsive to shocks of all kinds. And then the third is data as factor of production for businesses and farmers to be more productive. Then there's no such data only used for transparency but not for productivity. There's no data which is only used by the government. Well, I mean, there are certain data which is solely for government internal purposes, oftentimes national security related for any purposes. But most of data is not like that. By focusing narrowly, for example, on data for informing policy, we may be missing a lot because the data ecosystem, when it's mature, facilitates sharing and federation and integration through anonymizing personal information, generating aggregate statistics, complementing big data, which is not necessarily representative, but more frequent and add a lot of richness to administrative data that the government continues to collect and disseminate. So the data as asset, intangible asset, with near zero marginal cost of replication and dissemination, and a factor of production with natural inclination for market power concentration. If the firms, big firms with huge technological capability, keep accumulating and use it as a proprietary data. So data is actually a very strange animal. And then AI amplifies the characteristics, all characteristics of that data. So getting to this understanding and thinking through different implications on accountability, transparency, quality of policy and service delivery, as well as productivity and competition, both domestic and international. And then we can start to look at the big picture. And then we can talk about AI policy. We can talk about data governance. We can talk about industrial policy. And we can talk about investment in human capital, meeting demand, but also filling the more basic fundamental gap in a country like the Philippines, where, literacy and age-appropriate reading and comprehension is also very low. So it's a long answer to the simple question, but shorter version of the answer is let's take a bigger picture view. It's not just doing one silver bullet, quick, easy solution.
And I love how there's a key theme that's going on here, which is data is an asset. Government agencies here, as well as private sector, I guess, who are in this that's discussion right now, start thinking about what are those data that I'm collecting? How am I treating it? And whether those can be fed into AI. And before I even feed it into AI, how do I harness that as an asset for productivity, for transparency, accountability? And maybe that is that area where that's the first order of business, understanding that the model, in terms of AI, runs on data, and whether our data are good enough, and is it actually kept well enough for us to be able to harness this technology. Go ahead, Grace.
Hello. Yeah, thanks for that. Actually, the private sector is already doing it. So perhaps the government can learn from the private sector, right? I mean, with or without our consent, sometimes the private sector even uses our data. But of course, we need to all read the fine print. But I wanted to also discuss something that was discussed in a roundtable just last week, organized by I think it was the UP Law Center and Learn Asia. So there was a discussant there that said that he's wondering why the government cannot simply use data once collected. So he was saying, does the government or each government agency really have to base their decision to use the data that's collected on a law? Should there be a law for each and every time that data that's already there be used? Let's say, for example, PSA data. Why not use it for health? Why not? So these are, very basic and simple questions that we all know the government on a daily basis deals with. But he said something that really struck me. He said, there is inference can be made. He said, inference can be made that this data that's already collected by the government, considering data privacy rules and practices, that since it is data collected by the government and with for legitimate purposes, why not use it for, why not share it with other government institutions? So the answer, of course, we know the answer, right? Government agencies work in silos. Government agencies do not want to share for, many reasons. But that struck me because who owns this data that's with the government? Do we have a concept of data ownership? Is it really, let's say, our data, our personal data, for example? Of course, we own that. But what about data that's collected in agriculture, in transportation, in all these other industries? Who owns this data? Are the government agencies stewards of data? Do we even have that concept? Who is responsible for what happens to data when it already is with the government? And I'm not just talking about personal data. I'm not talking about data privacy. I'm talking about data from the public. So perhaps our distinguished panelists can answer.
But that's something to think about, right? Because at least in the Philippines, and having been in the field of privacy and cybersecurity, of course, the data privacy law has stringent requirements for consent and legitimate purpose for personal data. I was going to say for personal data. And therefore, the data sharing and data sharing agreements, I think, there should also be some template towards whether government to government can share data, and then the government to private sector. There are models. For example, in Thailand, I had this conversation where the data governance mechanisms was pushing towards the private sector sharing data to the government. And the private sector businesses and the industries was saying that if government and government don't share data, what's that mechanism for me? The end or the key takeaway from that roundtable that we did in Thailand with TDRI was that the government agencies, it's not necessarily leading the way, but showing that it could work. And therefore, it gives confidence from the private sector to also share data that can help in all this decision-making and all. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to add a little bit on that about data sharing and taking example from the private sector, how they have managed to operationalize this so well. Everyone in the room, you must have used an app, right? And this app, you are using it in multiple countries, and yet you are able to access your own same data, but accessing services being provided in multiple countries, right? But one app, one service provider. How are they able to do this, right? It's because when we share, the consumer share the data to this platform, this business service provider, it is clearly stated what their data will be used for, right? How your behavioral data is being collected, how it's being transmitted into multiple business entities that they have in all these multiple countries, and what are they going to be used for. So when you clearly define what data you collect, what they will be used for, where it might be placed at, those clarity actually give assurance to us as a user, as a consumer, to actually impart with our personal data and behaviors to all these technology giants. So if the same concept can be applied to government departments and ministries, would this work? It's a question that I throw back to our...
But there's this element of trust as well, right?
Correct.
You are surrendering some of your data, and it's personal data. How much do I trust that it will be taken care of, not be
Correct,
used
but
and all that?
Between government to government, it's not even personal data. It's really just data that each government offices have been collected. So if, let's say, agriculture government wants to share with a digital government, they just need to know what they want, what are they going to use for, and things like that. Yeah.
I see that you have something here, Naoto. Do you want to share about
Naoto,
this?
please.
No, just quickly, because you mentioned Data Privacy Act and the difficulty of data sharing and lack of trust. there are basic things and not necessarily very complicated, time-consuming things that we can do. So, well, Data Privacy Act in the Philippines is a good one. It was enacted as early as 2012. Yes. And it's very foresightful, it's clear, it's rights-based, but its implementation took long, and full awareness and implementation capability in the government and society is still catching up, right? So it took 4 years after 2012 to issue IRR and establish the National Privacy Commission. It took additional 5 years to clarify the penalty for non-compliance. Then so we still hear from government agencies saying, I cannot share data because of the DPA, but Data Privacy Act, but there's no personal information involved here. There was the NPC issuance on data sharing agreement, but NTC had to reissue another advisory clarifying that data sharing agreement is not mandatory in this case, that case. And there's a common understanding that the consent is the requirement, but consent is not the only legitimate interest. There are other means to provide legitimate interest, and this has to be proportionate. So many of these things, for example, once anonymized, it's no longer personal information, but there's no common, the anonymization standard. And then technology changes, there's the anonymization technologies, but once you clarify, in today's technology environment, if you do this and that, you can share it without signing on data sharing agreement. It's very easy.
Very easy. Chris, I'll fold you in, but if you are wondering, we're talking about data governance on an AI governance panel, let me reframe it a bit, because the data really is an important component why AI can increase productivity, transparency, accountability, and all. Maybe, Chris, I'll fold you in. Any global models that you're thinking of?
Yeah,
or
I think one thing too, this is a very, very important discussion, and I think this kind of the government-to-government question is one question, but also the government to the private sector, because as you mentioned, although there's consent, right, when you kind of enter into these agreements and you have apps collecting data across apps and tracking and providing kind of all this data that is kind of sold to data brokers and then goes to marketers that create kind of very sophisticated kind of packages that can like target you, but also to exclude some people, right, from that targeting, something that Meta has encountered. There's the question of cross-border flows and also government to private. And I think this gets into something where you see different trends here. So as we focus more on data as an asset, will data centers across many countries remain in private hands, right? Will there be a turn to kind of the nationalization of these in contexts where data is beginning to be understood in these terms? And also, if you think about digital infrastructures when it comes to the sharing of data, and you think about kind of where the data is going, just kind of one anecdote from kind of TICAD last month, when people in Japan began kind of registering for like Gmail email accounts, right? When Gmail was a new thing, right? All of that was going through kind of servers in the US. And it didn't come back, it didn't come to Japan until there was kind of a large enough scaling of that consumer base. And that's a very big economy, right? And so if you think about the challenges when it comes to data governance and data sharing, it's not just the kind of the practical difficulties, but the bigger question of how this then interacts with the kind of global data ecosystem.
Great, and that's because, again, AI, artificial intelligence, runs on localized data, and whether that increase in productivity, that foundation and base. Sometimes there's an analogy here on a cake, right? There's a boring conversation around the chiffon within the actual center, and AI is your icing, but that icing needs to be built on something, and that is that cybersecurity, data governance, data sharing, so that AI on top can run smoothly and fit for purpose, at least for the Philippine context. Let me take questions either on the floor or on Zoom, but we show love first to our Zoom people who's online. And I'll read some of the a few questions here from Ms. Fatima Joyce Borromeo on Zoom. There's an increasing use of AI in public governance, and how can policymakers, institutions effectively detect and prevent the spread of fake and manipulated images generated by AI, especially when they can influence public opinion or undermine trust in government communication? Are there tools, are there regulations or verification mechanisms that currently are being considered to address this issue? Maybe anybody from our panel would want to take that. Again, the question is on the proliferation of AI being used to shape public opinion and whether there are models to tackle these issues. Chris?
Yes, this is a very good question. And I think overall, and then I'll get into like the more specifics, but overall, this is not going away from our information environment, right? It's there. And it can be powerful, and we've seen in many different cases where you do have information campaigns that do kind of influence and sway and change public opinion. One answer to that, one approach to that is a growing digital literacy, to understand this new media environment and understand what these are and how they are generated. On the other hand, there are AI-enabled tools that help to better track the spread of this type of information in the digital environment, right? So if there is an information campaign on a particular issue in the Philippines, you would be able to know about it and detect and kind of go back and see where it, and then you could alert, as public institutions, alert the public as to this information campaign taking place. There's also kind of efforts to imprint generative AI images, regulations aimed at that. I mentioned, for example, China has sought to do so. These are difficult. And there are those at kind of foreign ministries who discuss this question. And even with all the resources of a state that would have a whole lot of resources to determine whether or not a kind of foreign kind of deepfake kind of person, right, that exists on the web is real or not, they're unable to do so, right? And so the fact that this exists, it's out there, and I think that gets into kind of the question of broader AI education and understanding, and also access in terms of digital infrastructure and the importance of that. Can you really have an education without understanding this, right, at a very kind of basic level from very early on in schooling?
And it's something around like digital literacy, right? Our conceptualization of what digital literacy means should change with the times. Before it was just teaching how to use a mouse, what are parts of a computer, and how to figure out deep fakes and all that. But maybe data literacy and algorithmic literacy as well can be part of all this. Maybe I go to Arifah first, and then I go to you, Grace.
With respect to the question that's being asked, specific tools or regulation, maybe it's worthwhile for me to share Malaysia's experience. Malaysia now has a social media license that is being imposed to all social media platforms with more than 8 million users. So literally the Facebook, the Metas, and everyone, right? And this was made possible because in Malaysia, there is a commission which owns the Communications Act, which is the Malaysia Multimedia and Communications Commission. So they own the Communications Act, so they are able to actually come up with this social media license and able to enforce it. There are key areas where all these social media platforms need to comply to, which includes content moderation. You know, at the moment that is flagged by the community that this content is harmful or it's fake, they are supposed to immediately take it off whilst investigation is ongoing. And the Commission has the power to actually suspend the ISP, actually block those social media platform providers from public usage, as well as fine them up to ₱1 million maximum fine. So this is the extreme case of licensing a social media platform with the purpose of actually protecting the larger public.
Great. Grace, you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you for that. I just wanted to add something about going back to, you know, the basic and fundamental skills we have. For example, deepfakes, as Professor said, will never go away. digital literacy is important, but we also need to take into consideration the respective jobs that we do. For example, teachers. How are teachers even equipped to teach about AI and how to detect whether AI is already fooling you? Teachers themselves should be better equipped to understanding the capabilities of AI, and it's not just asking ChatGPT. So it is very important that the teachers themselves are digitally literate, okay, not just the students. Secondly, we need to do a better job in investigating and doing forensics. I mean, if there is if there's deep fake and it's used for cybercrime or cyber security incident, then our law enforcers, those who are responsible for cybersecurity, should be able to detect and investigate whether these deep fakes, what these deep fakes are and the damage they've done, and who are the perpetrators. We need to provide better access to legitimate information. Where do we get legitimate information? I mean, Filipinos love YouTube, love Facebook, because really, before the Konektadong Pinoy Act was enacted, we relied on free, zero-rated content. It's not that bad if you think about it, because it is still access, but it is a way to spread mis and disinformation. People see platforms as legitimate sources of news. So we have to make sure that we are, as a society, funding legitimate sources of information. That's your academic institutions, research institutions, media. We have to, start or perhaps keep supporting legitimate sources of information if we are to combat deepfakes and disinformation.
Great, thank you, Grace. I know Naoto has some thoughts, but I want to raise some questions on the floor. Okay, hold off a little bit, sir. Thank you so much for standing by. But Naoto, do you want to jump in on this, or should we go to let's go to the questions instead, right, Naoto? Sir, can you introduce yourself very briefly and then your question?
I am Ebenezer Florano from the Data Science for Public Policy program of the University of the Philippines, and I also teach public policy. I would like to react to the statement, maybe I misunderstood it, to the statement of Professor Christopher Lamont about data is more important than model. I might have misunderstood it. I'm not dousing the importance of data. It's the new oil, actually. I am for data. That's why I'm in data science. But I'm going to say modeling, algorithm is equally important compared also with data. Because the issue of trust, when you are going to use AI, for example, IBM Watson detecting cancer. Do you know how it detects cancer? We know the input, but the processing, are we going to trust? Okay, if you're going to ride an AI car, are you going to trust your life with that AI car? Do you know how it senses danger and how it will prioritize the passengers over the pedestrians? So that's why there is now, because the algorithm of AI is considered a black box, especially if we are talking about deep neural network. Do we really know how it works? So I think we should also elevate the discussion on responsible AI. And that is a principle espoused by the EU AI Act. Okay, so I think we should be discussing responsible AI. And we, in my office, are helping with explainable AI, which is a method. So forget about my plugging, but I would like to emphasize model or algorithm is equally important compared with data. And algorithmic literacy is very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And I guess Chris and then Naoto, maybe a few reactions on the importance of algorithms and models, just as important as the data.
Yes, thank you for that wonderful question. And I think it provides me an opportunity to go a little bit deeper into this observation. What I was talking about was not saying that there's a hierarchy, right? That we should not pay attention to the properties of the model or the algorithms, but rather that when it comes to, and as you mentioned, kind of responsible AI and regulation, that only focusing on that element makes the task, if you think about kind of fast-paced change and regulations and kind of the challenges that we encounter, as creating potential blind spots. Because if you think about frontier models that are kind of the specific targets, or you think about kind of risk cases and defining of high risk, you can have smaller models that would fall outside the scope of that, which it's the model, right? So we should be looking at this, but in terms of evaluating, we need a more holistic picture. And I think that there getting into the data is very important, and particularly looking at if you're thinking about specific examples of misuse or models that can aid in doing kind of in activities that you would not want to see happen, there you would be looking at the data aspect. But absolutely, right, the question that's posed, right, we need algorithm literacy, we need to understand, we need to trust the logics that underlie and how these algorithms produce an outcome. And I think that the examples that were used are very good, because we're seeing not just, for example, again, trust in self-driving cars, but you can think about other sectors like civil aviation as well, right? Some people in this sector will talk about how very soon, or right now, right, it probably would be safer to have automated flight, yet we still allow human beings into the cockpit, right? And that generations from now might wonder, like, oh my gosh, they actually allowed human beings into a cockpit of a commercial airliner with other human beings on board. How crazy was that, right? And so all these observations are highlight that looking at this kind of narrowly from one perspective would help, but also is limiting. And so I think it's important, just because we think about data as being important in terms of training and the use, also understanding algorithm and algorithmic literacy is absolutely important. And we haven't really touched at all on this panel on like biases when it comes to this. So that's something also that we could consider.
Yeah, for sure. Models definitely, and algorithmic understanding and explainability comes in, where biases are part of the challenges that we are facing.
Yeah, and as the questioner had emphasized, right, this is not necessarily that just biases don't emerge just in the training or in the data, but they can also be at the design phase baked in, right? So
design, development, and deployment of the model. Now, do you want to jump in on some of these things? Model versus the data. Huh? Model.
Okay, so model and algorithms. Well, I think that in general, policy should be technology agnostic, but because people tend to talk about AI with very different things in mind, so it could be useful to differentiate, right? So old AI and new AI, these are different. That's I think the first step to differentiate, right? The traditional artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, for predictive analytics based on the structured data, this has been around for decades. This is an area where investments in data and metadata and quality assurance, supervised learning is important. This has been out for decades, and this has been informing policies and service delivery for a long time. But what's happening over the last 2 or maybe 3 years is the generative AI, which is not just structured data but unstructured data. And then the difference is the direct interaction of the model output with the humans, with much broader occupation and responsibility. So its impact is not just very different from old AI, as well as the industrial robot. for example, right? So the automation was limited previously to manual routine tasks. Now what we are seeing is the threat, the perceived threat of those who feel being displaced, engaged in cognitive and non-routine tasks. And the capability is evolving very, very fast. So the algorithm and the model is very different. Underlying data is different. And then if we talk about autonomous driving and all this, it's different from neither traditional AI or generative AI. It's about linking the capabilities to actuators and sensors and the physical electronic machinery. So let's not confuse. And then there should be, not necessarily technology-specific laws or regulations. There should be the principles overarching umbrella, but when linking, investments, the initiatives, the guidances, industry by industry, and applications, there has to be the proper assessment of benefits and risks, very specific to the use case.
Great. And what you're saying, it's sector-specific, use case-specific in terms of understanding the models. The data, whether it be used for automated driving, what we're thinking about right now is just generative AI. But there are also the machine learning on our apps that have been there for the last, 8, 10 years already, feeding us all this information depending on what we click or depending on what we like on our social media feed. So thank you for that. I know there's another question on the floor, a few more actually. Yes, sir. Please introduce yourself briefly, your organization, and then the question. Thank you so much.
Dan Agustin from the Bangsamoro region. And excellent are all your presentations and discussions. I address my question on governance to Professor Lamont. And on governance, and I'll not speak on the model, but try to ground it on the ground. And in your talk, you talk about the approaches, the various approaches, as well as the governance. It's good that we come from different countries. And under the UN, we have the UN, the 19 UN sustainability goals. Okay. Now, if we interject AI, how will AI enhance the achievement of these UN goals? Okay. So that's number one question. Number two question. We speak of collaboration among countries. But AI is a technology governed by intellectual property. Given this intellectual property, probably to protect the author or the authors of AI, how can they share it, for example, to the Philippines? As mentioned, we are simply a user, given these intellectual property rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. If I can recap the question, two parts, right? One, how does AI matter to the ground, which is the UN Sustainable Goals? And maybe I ask the panel, can we have some use cases, actual examples, thinking around like what AI has been used for in other countries? Maybe just to ground this discussion of like, what does it really look like for different countries, and even for the Philippines. And the second is on the IP, the IP discussion on our intellectual property discussion on AI. I'll open it up. Maybe first, Chris, I know you were asked to answer of some of those questions.
Yes, this is a good two-part question, and they're related, right? The second kind of draws upon the first, and thinking about, as you mentioned, two different approaches to kind of how we govern models, right? Kind of thinking about them as a closed and proprietary. This is how firms monetize, right, these models, and then also having kind of an ecosystem that has kind of more open, and a movement to opening up models that would be kind of allow you for kind of the tailor-made uses in different contexts without having to go through these kind of barriers or have the model itself something that you don't have access to. And I think in terms of the UN Sustainable Development Goals that you mentioned, there's not an easy answer. On the one hand, right, it's an accelerant. It gives accessibility to if you think about, for example, in the field of education that I work in, right? The resources that are now available, the focus on providing and creating this broader digital infrastructure, which has demands on energy that we've discussed earlier, is also creating kind of greater momentum and demands for the establishment of infrastructure that's not just for AI, that you can think about as just more kind of communications infrastructure, energy infrastructure, water infrastructure, and beyond, right? So the broader transformations that you're seeing are driving, right? And you can look in countries kind of far removed from Southeast Asia, right, that are also encountering kind of that are also encountering kind of similar developmental challenges, how this is being harnessed, right? And the opportunities that that's creating. But of course, as we mentioned, as panelists have also emphasized earlier on, there's no of trade-offs, right? That this also, and it might not be as desirable to have the full kind of infrastructure, right? That rather than thinking of this in terms of sovereignty and having everything, to think more loosely in terms of, for example, autonomy, right? And think about like what you want to do and what you're able to do and how you can kind of move around and have agency in this broader ecosystem. So,
Grace, any clear examples, UN SDGs, but what does AI application mean to the common person on the ground?
Right. I won't give an example, but I'd like to emphasize something that's consistently, throughout our discussion, we've consistently mentioned. Perhaps we should think about AI more as a tool. AI cannot solve or cannot, it cannot solve a broken system. It cannot fix a broken system. I always say we should go back to the more fundamental question. So in terms of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, we have to go back to whether, for example, our government agencies, let's say in health, education, are they able to perhaps address the current barriers that are institutional in nature, systemic in nature? AI cannot solve that. So what AI can do is actually augment and enhance what we humans can do. So if, for example, in processes, for example, it takes, let's say, a week to analyze data from the health sector, AI can do that in less than an hour, something like that. So that is what AI can do. So we have to start again, understanding what our problems, our basic problems are, and then use AI to enhance, augment, and perhaps help us accelerate processes.
Any of our AI can help us with our flood control projects? Chris, you mentioned this one, right?
Yeah, no.
You
Well,
mentioned
this is an absolute. This is an example, right? In terms of how AI can augment. I think one thing that's really important to emphasize here, though, is that there's a risk in seeing AI as kind of monolithic and as kind of this one path, right, towards AI transformation and digital transformation that's going to be kind of the same in all different contexts, but rather if we think about kind of the specific kind of examples that we're discussing here, you might have a problem for which AI is not the best solution as it exists today, right? And you might have mismatches here in terms of, well, we're prioritizing kind of broad-based adoption, but without thinking about the problem set that it's meant to address.
Thank you. There's a question from Facebook, actually. This is from Ms. Teves from FEF, Foundation for Economic Freedom, from Facebook. What will it take for governments to make transparency itself the next formal governance layer? So more than, if I understand the question correctly, how do we make true public good for all citizens? But is this all the question? Correct. All right, so it's government transparency, and let's contextualize this in the AI. And maybe I broaden the question a bit to everybody on the panel, right? Transparency is also a function of trust, and accountability. And as mentioned earlier, there's a AI and the models as a black box. How do we then layer this transparency over so that we can have some public trust around the governance mechanisms and the existing emerging technologies that will be used. Any one of us who wants to answer the question?
Yes. Okay. Well, I think defining what trust means in a datafied world, right, is something that governments are going to have to address. And you think about the amount of data that exists, where we talked about that earlier in the panel, on each one of us. And if you think about that in the context of what transparency meant in the past versus what transparency means now, right, I think if you think about the harm cases, like what does this mean for, and we get back to questions of privacy, we get back to questions about kind of what kind of society we want to live in, we get into questions about like kind of where is the agency behind decision making, and that itself is going to drive this discussion going forward, right? That these transitions, these transformations in terms of both decision-making tools, but also in terms of the data that exists and the data that's out there are going to drive this change. And whether or not it'll result in true public trust for all good citizens, as the questioner is posing, will depend on how governments address this question.
I want
Go ahead, Arifah.
I want to add a little bit to Chris's comment, response to this question. I think we should all take a step back and reflect a little bit that government alone cannot address transparency issues, right? Because AI as a technology is not just about the government, it is the whole ecosystem. I think we can use another analogy about, you know, we, like cars. I love to drive cars. Because of the automotive industry's mature ecosystem, I'm so happy to go to a showroom, sit in a new car, test drive it, thinking in mind that I'm safe using the seatbelt, the engine is safe, the speed that I'm going is safe because all of it has been tested. So it is the same as the progression of technology as well as AI. It takes time to mature, but it is not just it wasn't the government alone that designed this safety of automotive industry. It is actually the private sector with the government in coming up with the right laws and regulation, and then also it's also the consumers, because when you have the demand, then the private sector can actually improve the supply. If the demand is not there, then the supply is not there as well. So I think we should maybe relook at it, and it's not just the government alone, but it's the whole ecosystem.
Which gives me a little bit of, you mentioning cars, right, and driving on the road, and how did we end up in trusting that our system actually works, right? Why do we drive on the right side of the road and the left side of the road? Why do we follow the traffic lights and all? And this came to a long, hundreds of years before we all accepted that there is some sort of system in place, and it has been growing. And that's the challenge for an emerging technology, finding that situation where when we get into a car next time, we understand that we're driving the safe way, we trust the laws are in place, and there's some guardrails as well that would bring us to the right direction. Grace, do you want to jump in on this?
Yes. I'd like to add to what Professor mentioned earlier about how we view transparency has evolved. Say, disclaimer, okay? I will give a very controversial answer, so please bear with me. So transparency has evolved with technology. So it really depends on how you see transparency. Transparency is perhaps giving information about things, right? But I noticed that more and more, for some government agencies, transparency is just the use of their Facebook accounts and posting about their, MOU signing, stuff that's usually reserved for PR. What is transparency? Transparency is not just posting about, some visitors going to your office. Transparency is posting about your SAL-in. Transparency is posting progress of projects that are funded by taxpayers' money. That is transparency. So perhaps the government should look at how we use funds. Let's say, perhaps cut the budget for social media accounts and then put more budget into producing reports that actually contain information that has implications on our lives. Okay, so we have to look at technology. I mean, social media accounts are good. They update us. Almost all government agencies have social media accounts. But where are the reports that we need on flood control projects, for example? Where are the reports about what this particular project has done on the ground? That's the kind of transparency we need, and that's how we should use digital technologies. So there, I said it.
All right, I think we have at least one more room for a question around there. Yes, sir. Please. But Grace, I want to, as our friend or our audience member is coming up to the mic, to totally understand our definition of transparency changes each year. It's not necessarily, maybe if I give an example where transparency is even just posting it in bulletin boards before, right? What is that digital technology? What is that equivalent in the innovation age of whether we're able to access data, not only access data, but is the data available for that transparency, and whether AI or another frontier technology can help us with that. All right, sir, we have one more question very quickly on the...
Yeah, I'm Raul Perez of Business for Sustainable Development. We are a 33-year-old NGO advocating for integration of sustainability in business, originally called Philippine Business for the Environment. My question is, we were talking about various modes of governance for AI, which should include energy. I'm just curious, because in the decarbonization field, there's this concept of just transition. So I don't know if that is being discussed in various countries on how you handle any disruption in the workforce, laying off of people because of AI. I don't know if just transition is included in any of the governance discussion. Thank you.
Great. I think later as well, there will be a discussion on this on governance, energy, and AI, but very quickly across the panel, maybe just transition, it's the green and the digital transition altogether. How are countries managing it?
I guess, okay. So to begin, thank you for this question. It's an important one. One aspect to remember is that this is a fast evolving environment. And so one answer when it comes to AI in terms of access and some of the questions that we were dealing with earlier on this panel is the increase in efficiency, right? And so there are different perspectives on this. Will we need ever greater computing power? Will we need ever greater tech stacks that underlie kind of the most powerful models? Or if you think about just the actual kind of computing power of those chips that are being used within those stacks, right? You have huge inefficiencies, right? Maybe like only 40%, right? And that can be upped, we know, to much higher, right, number. And in that context, if you think about kind of the growing efficiency as kind of codes are getting better, will the energy demands decrease? Will the future be like cheaper, leaner models? Or are we looking at this kind of huge environmentally kind of taxing tech infrastructure or tech stack that would underlie that? And so there are a lot of discussions, right? And you saw it in New York, the UN Summit for the Future, and kind of in various other forums of governance of AI.
Great. Anyone else considering energy? Or we'll leave that. Let's leave that later as well. Thank you for that, Chris. Let's leave that later. I think we don't want to preempt the discussion in the afternoon. There's another hour really on just energy and transition and AI, and how do we power this AI revolution or transformation that we are having. So this is a very interesting discussion, but I want to leave some key questions as well, or key last statements from our panelists on a few things. And I know we're running out of time, but if there's one last question I ask the panelists is that the view and the discussion that we're having is grounded already. But at the same time, I want to ask if there's one low-hanging fruit for the audience, right? One low-hanging fruit that we can do, maybe in the next year or so, 12 to 18 months, just one low-hanging fruit, so that it helps us power the Philippines towards this AI journey. And maybe I start with you, Grace. Is there a low-hanging fruit that you think we can start thinking about for this AI journey and transformation in the Philippines?
I always look at the value of policy when we look at low-hanging fruits, because when you change policy, you change incentives, behavior, and the environment in which all of us will work in. So perhaps a low-hanging fruit would be looking at executive policy that will guide, let's say, government in terms of how to responsibly use AI. We can start with that. And how AI can be best used in better governance. So perhaps a policy direction towards responsible AI use in government.
Great. Policies towards responsible AI use. Naoto?
So, well, I do want to respond by low-hanging and high-hanging
All right, let's
together,
do it.
because this is an important topic, right? I think, well, sector by sector, agency by agency, there are specifics that can be done relatively quickly. So and that's my job, right? But for audience in this room and online, the really low-hanging fruit is absorb, digest, and then start talking about it with your circle, because there's a whole lot to absorb, but also think ahead and observe what's going on, then what would be the near-term opportunities, but also what are the risks. But beyond the low-hanging fruits, I think today's discussion highlighted local, national, international, multiple dimensions, need for multi-stakeholder engagement. To me, as a policy advisor and technologist, the eventual objective for the humanity is to harness emerging technologies for more equitable, just, sustainable world. And what we see is the opposite, right? So what the experience is that technology tend to expand rather than narrow the device, and technology tends to be skill biased. There should be policies to redirect development and adoption so that less wealthy people can take advantage of it, and government and civil society and businesses should be supportive of it. But we are not heading to that direction. What can we do about it? That, to me, a very, very high low fruit, and no single national government can do it only within one country, because the inequities and divides are across and within countries. There has to be much better international cooperation, international AI governance debates, and various other kinds of debates, including sustainable development goals. It's not on the right track, frankly. But the Philippines can be very interestingly diplomatically positioned over the next years, given the ASEAN and everything else. So in that context, there are a lot of low-hanging fruits in the room, because we come from all over the place, different sectors and different industries, and so many opportunities.
Thank you. And I guess very actionable. Your low-hanging fruit is very actionable, which is to talk about it within your teams. Think about really the key areas that you want to leverage, the digital technologies. But what Naoto is also saying is that do not lose sight of the real purpose, which is it should be just, it should be inclusive and sustainable. So as we build the ship, as we sail, maybe thinking about those clear direction or the North Star of that direction comes in. I'll put you last. Maybe Arifah, yeah. Is there a low-hanging fruit for this?
Okay, when you, in terms of public service delivery, usually low-hanging fruits would be public services which have high usage or high touch points with the public, right? So think of that as one, and choose a sizable, palatable project within that service to come up with the solutioning. And solutioning is not just about creating a space where you can create new product and solutions. You need to couple it together with regulatory adjustment. So usually when you come up with new products, you have a product sandbox. So you need to couple the product solutioning sandbox together with regulatory sandbox, whereby you actually use this product to test out the strength of your regulation, whether it's able to respond to it or not. So I think it's a more current version of what solutioning of public service delivery as evolved as compared to 10 years ago.
High touch points, high usage. Think about that in terms of your own teams as well as use cases. Chris?
I think it's the low-hanging fruit that builds into kind of higher-hanging fruit. And I think this conference contributes to this kind of low and high-hanging fruit, and that's AI literacy, right? Even among kind of leaders, even among those responsible for implementing AI adoption, there is very uneven literacy, even kind of not even a shared vocabulary, right, in terms of kind of very basic concepts. And for the youth of the Philippines, they're kind of growing up in a world where their information environment is going to be mediated algorithmically, right, in some form. And despite kind of the best efforts at governing these spaces, literacy and understanding of these information environments is something that just informing and just learning and kind of building and thinking about not just AI as something that's to be adopted, but AI as something that we need to learn about and kind of diffuse across the kind of educational sector, kind of all the way kind of from higher education down to lower level educations as AI is of increasing importance. So I think that would be my low, but building into a high hanging fruit.
Great, and this really is as visioning as we go through. Thank you so much for this very lively discussion for today. Thank you to our speakers and discussants for the opening conversation. And maybe I wrap up with three things, three Gs that I thought was a little bit or more of so that came as a theme across our discussion. First G is the groundwork needed for AI and transformative journey, which is actually, as Grace mentioned, it can be your infrastructure, your data sharing, and do we have the energy even to power that? That's your first G, so the groundwork. The second is the growth, meaning the capability that we need, not only the capability, but the capacity. Do we have the capacity even to think about the skills, the talent, resources that we need to be able to leverage AI, including the one point earlier was the legacy systems. Legacy systems is not only just about the technology, but there might be still legacy laws that we have that are not updated in the digital age. Something to think about, as Grace mentioned as well, the policy is one of the key areas that we need to think about. And lastly is the guardrails. How do we ensure with the visioning, and I think Chris and Naoto pointed to that there's a high-hanging fruit here. And what is that high-hanging fruit of like North Star that we should track, that as we build, as we go, we should always remember those guardrails that keeps us on track. So your groundwork, your growth, and your guardrails. I hope this discussion today in this plenary has set the stage for deeper conversations in the afternoon. We have very sector-specific as well as targeted conversations on energy, corruption, aging as well, how AI is going to be used for that. Our session and our plenary has given you an overview of the AI governance landscape, both at the regional and the global perspective, linking it into the Philippine context. Before we break for lunch, however, just a few quick reminders to our online participants. Please complete the feedback survey using the link and the QR code now shown on the screen. So if people as well can, I think they're going to check before you can eat lunch, that you have completed this survey. Please do, and completion of the survey as well is needed for some e-certificates that you would need for your own purposes. To our online audience, we'll be ending the live stream here for this morning's block. The afternoon sessions will not be live streamed, but the video proceedings will be posted and uploaded on the PIDS YouTube page. So like and subscribe, PIDS YouTube page, as well as follow them on Facebook. Again, I am Keith Detros. I'm from the Tech for Good Institute. It was a pleasure to moderate this discussion today. Let's all thank again Grace, Naoto, Arifah, and our keynote speaker, Professor Chris Lamont, for our discussion. Thank you so much, everybody.